The Lycan king had sworn he would never kneel to anyone. But the night he pressed his bleeding palm against the scar on her hand, he realized the curse had never been his greatest enemy. She was. And she was dying. Because Nyssara of Highcrest was not just the woman bound to him by blood. She was the daughter of the man who had tried to slit his throat. In Draekmar, there is an ancient law older than the throne itself. When a king's blood spills, and a woman bleeds shielding him, their lives bind beneath the moon covenant. Refuse the bond, and the wolf turns against its king. Claim her, and war begins. Kaelrith of Draekmar was not a man who feared war. He had carved victory from bone and fire. He feared something far worse. Wanting her. Because Nyssara had been raised to hate his kind. She was sent into his court as a diplomat, and perhaps something more dangerous. The blade that night was meant for his throat. She stepped between them. Her blood touched his, and the wolf chose. He should have claimed her immediately. Instead, he chained himself during the full moon and refused to touch her at all. This is the story of how a ruthless Lycan king went to war, not for land, not for power, but for the enemy's daughter he swore he would never love. Before we step into Draekmar, I want to know something. Where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop your city and your local time in the comments. Are you wide awake under the moon? On your way to work? Or hiding from the world with a story in your ears? Tell me where you are. The pack spans continents, and I always read every single one. I was not supposed to be in Draekmar that night. Few are, who do not carry claws or a death wish, and I carry neither. I am only what I have always been, a witness. A recorder of things the powerful would rather erase. And what I witnessed in that stone-black hall, beneath a sky bruised with the season's last full moon, was the beginning of something that should never have been possible. The King of Draekmar does not grant audiences. He grants verdicts. I watched him from the upper gallery, half-shadowed behind a pillar carved in the likeness of a snarling wolf. Below, the great hall was silent in the way that silence becomes a weapon, pressed flat against the walls, held tight in the chests of every alpha, soldier, and servant present. Kaelrith stood at the base of his obsidian throne, not seated upon it. That, I had learned, was deliberate. A seated king may be approached. A standing one is a warning. The prisoner before him was a Highcrest officer, young. Still wearing the silver-threaded collar that marked him as a border commander. He was on his knees, though I suspect he had not knelt willingly. Kaelrith said something low. I could not hear it from where I crouched, but I did not need to. I watched the officer's face instead, watched hope leave it, the way a candle surrenders to wind. Whatever mercy he had traveled here expecting, it was not waiting for him in this hall. It never was. The crescent scar along Kaelrith's throat caught the torchlight as he turned. I had heard the story of that scar before I ever set foot in Draekmar. Every court gossip and border trader knew it. Lord General Varric of Highcrest. A blade meant to sever. A king who survived and never forgave the distinction. What the gossips never said was how Kaelrith wore it. Not like a wound. Like a reminder he had chosen to keep. The execution was swift. It always is, with him. There is no theater in his cruelty, and I think that is what makes it so much worse. Theater implies emotion. This was administration. Afterward, the hall breathed again. Slowly. Unevenly. The elders gathered at the far end murmured behind iron-ringed hands, their eyes tracking their king the way prey tracks something it prays will not turn around. He turned around. Increase the patrols on the Vethkara Pass, he said, to no one in particular, which meant everyone in the room. Highcrest is growing bold again. No one asked how he knew. No one ever did. I recorded all of it. The silence. The verdict. The scar catching the light. I did not yet know that 3 days later, a woman from Highcrest would walk through those same doors. Or that she would bleed in this hall. Or that when her blood touched his, nothing in Draekmar would ever be administered so cleanly again. She did not arrive like someone who expected to be devoured. That was the first thing I noticed. Most humans who enter Draekmar do so with their fear poorly concealed, eyes too wide, steps too careful, hands betraying them at the wrists. They smile at the wrong moments. They go quiet at the wrong ones. Fear has a rhythm, and Draekmar's wolves hear it long before the source of it reaches the gate. Nyssara of Highcrest had no such rhythm. She rode in at midday, when the black cliffs swallow the sun and the fortress sits in its own shadow like something that has never needed light. Her escort was small, 6 soldiers, a scribe, and a banner carrying Highcrest's iron seal. She rode at the front. Not beside her guard captain. Ahead of him. I watched from the inner courtyard as she dismounted. She did not wait for assistance. She handed her reins to the nearest stable hand with the practiced ease of someone who had been entering enemy territory since before it was called diplomacy. The receiving party was led by Elder Sorvan, oldest of the council, silver-maned, unsmiling. He regarded her the way one regards a letter written in a language you do not trust. She regarded him the same way. Draekmar extends its conditional welcome, Sorvan said. The word conditional landed exactly where he intended it. Highcrest extends its gratitude, she replied, for the conditions. A beat of silence. Sorvan's eyes narrowed slightly. Hers did not move at all. I wrote, she is not here to be welcomed. She already knows she won't be. Kaelrith received her in the map room, not the throne hall. Another deliberate choice. The throne hall is ceremony. The map room is where he actually governs, and bringing her there was its own kind of message. I am not performing for you. This is what I actually am. She entered without hesitation and stopped 3 feet from the table's edge, close enough to see the maps clearly, far enough to communicate she had not come to be crowded. Her eyes moved across the spread of parchment before she looked at him. He noted it. I noted that he noted it. Lord General Varric sends his formal petition, she said, producing a sealed document and setting it on the table without ceremony. A proposed reduction of border skirmishes in exchange for Draekmar's withdrawal from the Vethkara trade routes. Your father sends his daughter to deliver a document he could have sent by courier, Kaelrith said. That is either an insult or a strategy. It is both, she said. He thought you'd appreciate the honesty. Something shifted in the room. Not warmth, nothing as yielding as that. More like 2 locked mechanisms recognizing each other's resistance. He studied her face. She let him, the way someone lets a storm pass overhead without flinching. You have 3 days, he said finally. The elders will review the petition. I'll need 4. He looked at her for a long moment. 3, he repeated. She did not argue. But I noticed she did not agree either. I wrote, she is counting something. I am not yet sure what. Neither, I think, was he. I have recorded wars. Famines. The quiet collapse of kingdoms that believed themselves eternal. I have never recorded anything quite like a man fighting himself. The full moon rises differently over Draekmar. Elsewhere it is simply light, cold, indifferent, a thing poets borrow and return undamaged. Here it is pressure. It settles into the fortress like a second inhabitant, and every wolf within these walls feels it in the marrow. I felt it too, in my own lesser way. A tightening. A held breath the body forgets to release. For Kaelrith, I am told, it had never been this bad. I learned later what the blood right does to the bond in those early days, how it does not wait for acknowledgement, how it does not care for political inconvenience. The moon pulls at the thread between them whether he permits it or not. And that night, 3 days after Nyssara's arrival, the thread pulled hard. I did not see him chain himself. I only heard it. The sound carried through the stone corridor outside his sealed chambers, iron against iron, the specific weight of restraint chosen over surrender. A deliberate sound. Methodical. He had done this before, I realized. Just never for this reason. Nyssara's chambers were 2 floors above. I know because I watched her window from the courtyard below. The light stayed on long after the rest of the fortress had gone dark. At some point, the light stopped moving, she had ceased pacing, which meant she had begun listening instead. She heard it too. I cannot tell you what crossed her face in that moment. I was too far below, and the window was too narrow. But I can tell you she did not look away from the direction of the sound. I can tell you her hand rose, slowly, without apparent intention, and pressed flat against the stone wall beside the frame. As though she could feel something through it. She could. The bond does not require understanding to function. It requires only blood, and blood had already been exchanged. Her palm, still healing where the blade had caught her at arrival, a shallow cut from a splinter of stone when she'd been moved too quickly through the gate, had brushed his arm in the map room. Neither of them had remarked on it. The elders had. Below, the chain sound came again. Longer this time. Then silence of a different quality. The silence of something enduring rather than resting. I watched Nyssara's window. She moved. Toward the door, I think, based on where the light shifted. She was stopped before she reached it, not by a guard, there was no guard yet, but by something internal. Some calculation she ran and did not like the outcome of. She returned to the window instead. I wrote, she wanted to go to him. She is not yet sure what that wanting means, and that uncertainty is the only thing that stopped her. In the morning, Kaelrith emerged from his chambers looking like a man who had won a war he was exhausted by winning. The iron was gone. His expression was sealed as ever. He walked past two elders without acknowledging them and went directly to the training yard. Nyssara was already there. Neither of them spoke of the night before. But I noticed she stood slightly closer to him than she had the previous day. And I noticed he did not step back. Small things. The kind that only matter in retrospect. I recorded them anyway. Power is loudest when it feels threatened. I have observed enough councils to know the sound, the particular pitch of men who mistake volume for authority, who sharpen their words because they have nothing sharper to hand. The Draekmar Elder Council convened at dawn, 2 days after the full moon, in a chamber so old the walls had begun to absorb the arguments held within them. The stone itself felt opinionated. I found my place in the upper passage that runs behind the ventilation lattice. Cold air. Poor sightlines. Perfect acoustics. There were 9 elders present. 3 said nothing the entire session, which told me more about the internal alliances than anything spoken aloud. Elder Sorvan opened without preamble. The bond is confirmed. The markings have progressed to the second stage. We are running out of time in which inaction remains a viable position. Inaction, said Elder Routh, broad-shouldered, younger than the others, with the particular restlessness of an alpha who had never been told no and resented every occasion since, is a generous word for what the king is doing. Silence from the other 8. The careful kind. The king, Sorvan said, with the measured tone of someone diffusing something, is managing a political situation of considerable complexity. The king, Routh replied, is letting a Highcrest woman walk these halls unclaimed while our pack reads it as weakness. Which it is. More silence. The 3 who had said nothing shifted almost imperceptibly. I noted it. There are those among the outer keeps, Routh continued, who would interpret an unclaimed bond as grounds to challenge the throne. I am not suggesting it. I am reporting it. The distinction, I thought, was thinner than he believed. Sorvan turned to an elder I did not yet know by name. Slight, female, with the stillness of someone who calculates before she breathes. She had been watching the lattice wall since I arrived. I had the unsettling suspicion she knew I was there. Elder Vane, Sorvan said. Your counsel. Vane did not look away from the wall. The bond will not wait for the council's comfort, she said. The question is not whether the king claims her. The question is whether he does so before the faction that wants her dead decides to simplify the problem. The room absorbed this. She should be sent back, said a voice from the far end, Elder Marin, old enough to remember the last border war, which perhaps explained his preference for avoiding the next one. Return her. Sever whatever diplomatic pretense brought her here. Let Highcrest interpret it as they will. The bond cannot be severed by geography, Vane said, still not moving. He would weaken regardless. And a weakened king is a more dangerous political problem than an unclaimed mate. Routh leaned forward. Then claim her and be done with it. War with Highcrest was coming regardless. I wrote, he is not wrong. He is also not the one who would survive it. The council did not reach a conclusion. Councils rarely do when the matter sits above their jurisdiction and they know it. What they reached instead was an agreement to present their concerns formally to Kaelrith at the evening meal, a gesture that would allow everyone present to say they had acted, regardless of outcome. I left before they finished. I wanted to find Nyssara. I located her in the eastern corridor, standing before a weapons display mounted between 2 archways, Draekmar steel, moonforged, the blades carrying that faint blue sheen that human metallurgy has never managed to replicate. She was studying them with the focused attention of someone who was not admiring craftsmanship. She was assessing capacity. A young wolfguard stood 3 paces behind her, assigned that morning and visibly uncertain whether his role was escort or surveillance. Probably both. He had not yet learned that the distinction rarely matters. These are ceremonial, she said, without turning. The guard blinked. My lady. The balance is wrong for combat. The hilts are decorative. She tilted her head slightly. Who actually arms your border units? The guard said nothing. Wisely. She turned then, and whatever she saw in his expression made her abandon the question. She glanced once toward the council chamber corridor, as though she had heard something, or felt it, and then walked in the opposite direction. I wrote, "She is gathering information. She has not yet decided what to do with it." That evening, Kaelrith sat through the Elder Council's formal presentation of concerns with the expression of a man reading weather reports for a storm he has already decided to walk into. When they finished, he said, "Noted," and left the table. Rauther's jaw tightened. Vane watched the door. Sorvan closed his eyes briefly, the way the very tired do when they need a moment that no one will give them. The bond markings, I was told, had reached the third stage by midnight. No one slept well in Draekmar that night. Least of all, I think, the two people 2 floors apart who were both pretending they didn't know why. She came to him at midnight. Not as a supplicant. Not with softness. She came the way she did everything, with her spine straight and her conclusions already drawn, needing only confirmation before she acted on them. The guards outside his study let her pass without question, which told me Kaelrith had anticipated her and given the order in advance. He was already standing when she entered. Facing the window. I found my place in the alcove behind the bookcase, a gap in the architecture that I suspect was originally intended for something more sinister than observation. The room smelled of cold stone and burnt parchment, the particular scent of a man who reads his correspondence and then destroys it. Nyssara closed the door herself. "Tell me what happened to my hand," she said. No preamble. No diplomatic softening. 3 days of watching, listening, and calculating had led her here, to this room, to this question, and she was not interested in the scenic route. Kaelrith turned from the window. In the lamplight the scar at his throat was a pale crescent, almost lunar. I have often thought that detail was too precise to be accidental. The man marked by the moon long before the moon marked him in return. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand." A pause. He assessed her the way he assessed everything, without visible reaction, filing the information somewhere behind his eyes where it would be retrieved later and used without warning. "What do you know about the blood rite?" he asked. "Nothing. That's why I'm here." He told her. Plainly, without embellishment, the way he delivered all information he considered operationally relevant. The ancient decree. The conditions. The moon covenant. The consequences of a bond unclaimed. He spoke for perhaps 4 minutes without interruption, which I believe is the longest Kaelrith of Draekmar has spoken to any single person since his generals stopped arguing with him. When he finished, the room was very quiet. "That," Nyssara said, "is superstition dressed in ceremony." "Your palm has been warm since the night of the feast," he replied. "Your sleep has been disrupted. You feel it when the moon rises, though you have been telling yourself it is the unfamiliar climate." Something moved across her face, quickly, controlled, but present. She had not expected him to know that. "You cannot leave Draekmar," he continued. "Not while the bond is active and unclaimed. The physical consequences alone. You're telling me I'm a prisoner. I'm telling you the situation. Those are the same thing." He did not deny it. That, I think, was what sharpened her anger most, not the captivity itself but his refusal to apologize for naming it honestly. She had been raised among men who dressed their cruelties in courtly language. Kaelrith's directness was its own kind of disorientation. "And if I refuse?" she asked. "The bond, the claim, all of it. If I simply refuse? Then I weaken. My wolf becomes unstable. The pack reads it as an open throne." He paused. "And you continue experiencing echo pain that will intensify with every moon cycle until one of us ends it." "How?" The word landed flat. She meant it as a question. It arrived as something colder. "There are 2 ways to end a blood right bond," he said carefully. "Claim. Or death." The silence that followed was of a different quality than all the silences before it. It had weight. It had edges. "Whose death?" she said. "Either." I wrote, "She is not afraid. She is calculating." Those are different things, and he knows it, and I think that is the first moment he becomes genuinely uncertain of her. She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at her palm, at the scar still faintly pink along the heel of her hand, with an expression I could not fully name. Not fear. Not grief. Something more like fury at her own body for participating without her permission. "I want separate chambers," she said finally. "And access to your Eastern library." He studied her. "The library. If I am staying, I will understand where I am staying. Your border logistics are worse than Highcrest reports suggest, and I intend to know why. Another long pause. Something shifted in his expression. So slight I nearly missed it. Not warmth. Not yet. Something more preliminary than that. The library, he said, closes at the second bell. She nodded once and walked to the door. Nyssara. She stopped but did not turn. You stepped in front of a blade, he said. Whatever your reasons, I am aware of the cost. A beat of silence. Don't be, she said. I hadn't decided to yet. It was instinct. She left. I remained in the alcove a while longer, watching Kaelrith stand motionless in the center of the room, looking at the closed door with the expression of a man who has just discovered an unknown variable in a calculation he believed he had already solved. I wrote, he believed attachment was the crack enemy's exploit. He has just met someone who treats her own instincts as the enemy. He recognizes the strategy. That is the problem. Power, when it cannot move openly, moves through kitchens. I have seen it happen in 3 kingdoms and 1 republic. The method changes, wine, broth, the underside of a bread roll, but the logic is always the same. Remove the inconvenience quietly. Let grief do the political work that conflict cannot. Draekmar's radical faction was, if nothing else, efficient. It was 11 days after Nyssara's arrival. She had settled into a rhythm that I suspect surprised even her. Mornings in the Eastern Library, afternoons observing the training yard from the upper terrace, evenings in her chambers with maps she had begun annotating in her own hand. She ate alone, by choice. The kitchen staff had grown cautiously warm toward her, in the way that people who are paid to be invisible recognize someone else practicing the same skill. That evening she was late to her meal. A delay caused, I later learned, by a conversation with a junior cartographer who had noticed her annotations and wanted, nervously, to discuss them. The wine had been poured and waiting for 20 minutes by the time she entered. Kaelrith arrived first. I do not know what brought him there. He had not dined with her before. He has never adequately explained it, to anyone. What I know is that he entered the small dining room off the eastern corridor, registered the single setting, the waiting glass, and stopped. He crossed the room in 4 steps and lifted the wine. He smelled it for perhaps 2 seconds. Then he set it down with a precision that was somehow more frightening than if he had thrown it, turned to the guard at the door, and said a single name. Quietly, the way he said everything, that I will not record here because what followed was not something I care to describe in detail. I will say only that the member of the radical faction who had arranged the evening's menu did not require much encouragement to provide a full accounting of who had given the order. Nyssara arrived to find her dining room occupied by 4 of Kaelrith's personal guard, an overturned chair, and the king himself standing at the window with his back to the room and his hands very still at his sides. She looked at the wine glass, at the guards, at the particular quality of stillness Kaelrith was performing. How long has it been sitting? She said. Long enough, one of the guards answered. She said nothing further. She sat down, poured water from the carafe the guards had already tested, and began to eat what remained of her meal with the composure of someone who had been raised to expect that someone, eventually, would try this. Kaelrith did not move from the window. You can turn around, she said, after a while. I'm not going to thank you. I'm not waiting for thanks. Then what are you waiting for? He turned. In his expression was something the court had not seen publicly in years, something unguarded, residing in the set of his jaw rather than his eyes, in the way his hands had not quite returned to their usual stillness. The pack would call it possessiveness. He would call it something else. I called it, the first thing he has felt in a long time that he cannot administer away. He looked at her, at the scar on her hand, at the straight line of her shoulders, at the complete absence of performance in the way she sat, and then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. No explanation. No ceremony. The guard at the door exchanged a look with his colleague that I expect kept them occupied in whispered conversation for the remainder of the week. They ate in silence, the 2 of them. But it was a different silence than all the ones before it. Less like opposition. More like 2 people standing on the same side of something, not yet ready to name what it is. I wrote, the pack noticed. They always do. By morning, the story had traveled to every keep within riding distance. The king had sat at her table. In Draekmar, there is no such thing as a small gesture. Respect is a quieter thing than people expect. It does not arrive with declarations. It does not announce itself in council chambers or across negotiating tables. In my experience it arrives sideways, in the pause before a dismissal that doesn't come, in the second look given to someone who was only supposed to receive one. It arrived in Draekmar on a Tuesday, in a training yard that smelled of iron shavings and morning frost, while Nyssara of Highcrest stood at the upper railing and took apart Draekmar's military strategy with the focused attachment of someone solving an arithmetic problem that happened to involve 10,000 lives. She did not know he was below her. Or perhaps she did, and had decided it didn't matter. I have never been entirely certain which, with her. The yard was full, 24 wolf soldiers running formations, their movements carrying that particular Lycan fluidity that human troops spend years failing to replicate. Precise. Economical. Built for terrain rather than pageantry. She had been watching them for 4 mornings without comment, and I had watched her watching, noting the way her eyes tracked not the individual fighters but the gaps between them. That morning she had brought parchment. She was writing when Kaelrith entered the yard below, and she did not look up. He ran them through 3 formation drills without acknowledging the terrace. On the 4th drill he changed the pattern, a tight pivot maneuver along the yard's eastern edge, and something in her writing hand slowed. She looked up. Watched the formation complete. Wrote something. "The pivot loses you 4 seconds on broken ground," she said. The yard went quiet. 24 wolf soldiers and their king turned to look at the woman on the terrace with the parchment and the ink-stained fingers and the expression of someone who had not intended to speak aloud and had decided, having done so, not to retreat from it. Kaelrith looked up at her. "Explain." "Not who asked you. Not this is none of your concern." I noted that. So did every soldier in the yard. She descended the terrace steps without being invited, which also did not go unremarked. She crossed the yard, wolves stepping aside with the confused instinct of predators encountering something they cannot correctly categorize, and stopped beside the eastern wall. "Here," she said, indicating the ground. "The formation assumes level footing for the pivot anchor. Your border passes don't offer that. When the anchor slips, the whole line compresses inward and you lose the eastern flank exposure you were trying to create." A long silence. "You've been to the Vethkara Pass," Kaelrith said. It was not a question. "I've read your surveyor's reports. The ones in the Eastern Library that haven't been filed correctly in 11 years. She glanced at him sideways. "Your archiving system is also a problem, but a smaller one." Something moved through the assembled soldiers, not quite amusement, not quite discomfort. The specific collective tension of men watching their commander encounter an argument they cannot immediately refute. Kaelrith studied the ground she had indicated. Then he looked at the formation. Then, with the particular economy of a man who does not perform deliberation, he turned to his senior captain. "Run it again. Adjust the anchor point 2 feet north." The captain blinked once. Obeyed. The formation ran. The pivot completed, cleaner, faster, the eastern line holding its exposure through the turn. The yard was very quiet. Kaelrith did not say you were right. He did not need to. The adjusted drill said it for him, and they both understood that currency. He looked at her parchment. "What else?" She looked up at him with an expression I had not seen on her before, not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. The slight recalibration of someone who had prepared for resistance and must now adjust to its absence. She looked back at her notes. "Your supply lines through the northern pass have a 3-day vulnerability window every time the river runs high. Highcrest knows about it. They've known for 2 years." "I know," he said. "Then you know they'll use it." "I know," he said again. Different weight this time. She looked at him properly then. Not the assessing look she gave everyone, something more considered. He met it without flinching, which she had perhaps not expected, and did not look away, which I suspect she had expected even less. "I wrote, she came here to gather intelligence. She has just given him some instead. I do not think she has fully accounted for what that means." They stood in the training yard while the soldiers reformed around them, 2 people occupying the same silence with the careful deliberateness of those who have only recently discovered they are not enemies in the way they expected to be. It was not warmth. Not yet. But it was the shape that warmth grows inside, and I have been recording long enough to know the difference. That evening, a junior elder reported to Sorvan that the king had spent 4 hours reviewing supply line documentation he had previously delegated. Sorvan reportedly said nothing. But he did not look surprised. I wrote, "Respect, when it arrives sideways, tends to stay. It is harder to dismiss than admiration. Harder to survive than contempt." They were both beginning to understand that. Ultimatums are written by people who believe distance makes them safe. Lord General Varric of Highcrest had never set foot in Draekmar. I suspect he constructed his image of it from battlefield reports and the fearful accounts of soldiers who had survived border engagements and returned home with the particular hollowness of men who had seen something they could not explain. He understood Draekmar as a military problem, a terrain challenge, a species to be managed. He did not understand it as a place where his daughter had begun annotating supply maps. The letter arrived on a grey morning, carried by a Highcrest courier who had the rigid posture of someone performing bravery rather than possessing it. He was received at the gate, relieved of his correspondence, and escorted to a waiting room where he was offered water and no conversation for 3 hours before being sent home with a sealed reply he was not permitted to read. I read the original. Varric's letters have a particular style, declarative, impatient, structured like military orders because he has never learned to write anything else. This one opened with a formal demand for Nyssara's immediate return, escalated through 3 paragraphs of increasingly thin diplomatic language, and concluded with the sentence that mattered. Continued detainment of Highcrest's envoy will be interpreted as an act of war. Below it, in a different hand, a secretary's, I think, added at the last moment, was a single line. She is being held against her will by creatures who do not understand what she is. I have thought about that line many times since. The particular cruelty of a father who reduces his daughter to a category in order to justify what he intends to do next. Kaelrith read the letter once, set it on his desk, and sent for Nyssara. She arrived already knowing. I am still not certain how, whether some fragment of the bond carried his mood before his words could, or whether she had simply learned to read the temperature of a room before she entered it. Either was possible with her. He slid the letter across the desk without preamble. She read it. Her face did not change, but her breathing did, shallower, briefly, before she corrected it. She set the letter down with the same precision he had used and looked at the window. He'll mobilize within 30 days of receiving your reply, she said. Regardless of what it says. The letter is a formality. He made this decision before he sent it. I know. Then you know the reply doesn't matter. The reply, Kaelrith said, is for the elders. Not your father. She looked at him then. Something shifted in her expression, the slight recalibration of someone filing new information about how a mind works. He held her gaze. I am offering you return passage to Highcrest. Formal escort. Safe conduct as far as the border. The room went very still. I wrote, he means it. That is what makes it complicated. She was quiet for long enough that the offer acquired texture, became something she was turning over rather than simply receiving. Outside, the training yard sounds filtered up through the window. Steel on steel. The cadence of the morning drills she had begun to know by rhythm. If I leave, she said slowly, the bond will weaken me. Yes. And the pack will read it as instability. Yes. And the radical faction will move against you. Possibly. She looked at the letter again. At her father's handwriting, which she had known since childhood, had watched sign orders, had seen pressed to correspondence she was never meant to read. She knew that hand the way you know the architecture of a place you grew up inside. Every angle of it. He called me misguided, she said quietly. Not wounded. Precise. He did. She was silent a moment longer. Then she folded the letter once, neatly, along its original crease, and slid it back across the desk. I'm staying, she said. Kaelrith looked at her. Not with relief. He was too controlled for that, and she too proud to want it. But with the focused attention of a man recalculating something fundamental. Nyssara. I am not staying for you, she said clearly. I want that understood. I am staying because leaving hands my father a narrative I refuse to give him. I will not be the daughter who was rescued from the wolves. A pause, brief and edged. I am also staying because your northern supply line vulnerability will get 3,000 people killed if someone doesn't fix it, and your archivists are apparently incapable of filing things correctly. The silence that followed had an almost architectural quality. Solid. Weight-bearing. Understood, he said. She stood. Smoothed her sleeve. Moved toward the door with the deliberate composure of someone who has made a decision they intend to inhabit completely. Kaelrith. She stopped. He had not used her name without title before. She did not remark on it, but I noted the slight pause in her step. The elders will need to be told, he said. Your decision to stay, it will be interpreted. Let them interpret it. She opened the door. I've been misread by more dangerous people than your council. She left. I remained, watching Kaelrith sit at his desk with her father's letter folded between them and an expression I had not yet seen on him. Not quite relief, not quite dread, but something occupying the territory between the two. He picked up a pen. Set it down. Picked it up again. He wrote 4 words of his reply to Varric before stopping, reading them back, and beginning again. I did not see what the first 4 words were. I have always suspected I know. That afternoon the elders were informed. Sorvan received the news with the stillness of a man who had been expecting it. Routh received it with the stillness of a man who had been hoping for something else. Vayne, I was told, simply nodded. She chose, Vayne said, to no one in particular. That changes the geometry. By evening, the story had reached the outer keeps. By the following morning, it had reached Highcrest. I wrote, her father received the news at his war table, surrounded by generals. I was not there to see his face. I did not need to be. There is a particular kind of attention that precedes understanding. Not attraction, that is simpler, more immediate, a thing the body decides without consulting the mind. This was something slower, more structural. The kind of attention that rebuilds the image of a person from the outside in, replacing assumption with observation until what remains is accurate in a way that becomes its own problem. They had been watching each other for weeks now, but the quality of the watching had changed. I noticed it first in the mornings. Nyssara had developed a habit of arriving at the training yard before the drills began, not to observe from the terrace as she had initially, but at ground level now, moving along the yard's perimeter with her annotated maps and the quiet self-containment of someone who has decided a space belongs to her through consistent occupation rather than permission. The wolves made room. Not warmly, not always, but they made it. There is a pragmatism to pack hierarchy that outsiders rarely appreciate. Usefulness confers a kind of standing that bloodline cannot always buy. She had become, cautiously and without ceremony, useful. The supply line restructuring she had proposed 3 weeks prior had been implemented along the northern pass. The results had come back clean, the vulnerability window reduced from 3 days to 18 hours, which in border logistics is the difference between manageable and catastrophic. Kaelrith had said nothing to her about it directly. He had instead given her access to the Western Archive, which in Draekmar is the equivalent of several kinds of declaration. She had accepted it without comment. This was the rhythm they had built, communication in the currency of access and adjustment rather than acknowledgement. It suited them both, I think. 2 people trained to read the subtext beneath the surface had found a subtext they could almost work with. Almost. That morning Kaelrith ran the formations himself, which he did not always do. I watched Nyssara notice this from across the yard, the slight shift in her posture when he descended from the command platform to take the anchor position himself, demonstrating the adjusted pivot she had identified 3 weeks prior. He ran it at full speed. The formation held perfectly. She did not applaud. She did not remark on it. She made a single notation on her parchment and turned to the next page. But I was close enough to see that the notation was not tactical. It was a question mark, followed by 3 words she crossed out before I could read them. I wrote, she is doing the thing she was trained not to do. She is becoming curious about him as a person rather than a variable. After the drills, the soldiers dispersed for the midday break. The yard emptied to its bones, raked sand, iron rings on the eastern wall, the low Draekmar sun at its flat winter angle. Kaelrith remained at the center, working through a solo sequence with the focused internal quality of a man solving something that has nothing to do with the movement itself. Nyssara stayed too. She sat on the low stone bench at the yard's edge, maps across her knees, and worked. Or appeared to. I noticed the maps did not turn for a long time. The sequence you run after the drills, she said eventually. It's defensive. He completed the movement before answering. Yes. Your offensive sequences are different. Wider. More aggressive in the shoulder. A pause in his rhythm. Brief. You've been cataloguing my fighting style. I catalogue everything. A beat. It's a survival habit. He lowered his practice blade and looked at her across the empty yard with the direct attention he gave to things he was reassessing. What does the catalogue say? She considered the question with the seriousness it apparently deserved. That you lead offensively in war and defensively in private. Which means the court sees a different fighter than the battlefield does. She looked at her maps, then back at him. Most kings are the opposite. The Yard held the silence between them carefully, the way the old stone of Draekmar held everything, without comment, without judgment, simply as record. Most kings, he said, have not fought the battles I have. No, she agreed quietly. They haven't. Something in that agreement, its lack of flattery, its simple accuracy, crossed the Yard between them with a weight that neither reached for and neither deflected. It settled where it settled. He crossed the Yard and sat on the opposite end of her bench. Not close. Not far. The deliberate middle distance of two people who have stopped pretending they are not aware of each other and have not yet decided what to do with that awareness. He picked up one of her discarded maps. Studied it. You've rerouted the eastern supply line, he said. Tentatively. The terrain near the second ridge is inconsistent in the older surveys. I need current measurements before I'd commit to it. I'll have the surveyors run it. She looked at him sidelong. Just like that. The logic is sound. You haven't checked it yet. No, he said. But you haven't been wrong. The silence that followed was different from all the ones before it. Not the silence of withheld conflict, or political calculation, or restrained instinct. Something quieter than all of those. Something that did not yet have a name in either of their vocabularies and which both of them were therefore pretending was something else. I did not pretend. I wrote. This is where it begins. Not with the blood and the bond and the ancient decree. Here. In a training yard at midday, over supply maps and a sentence that cost him more than he let show. He told her she had not been wrong. For Kaelrith of Draekmar, that is not a small thing to say. For Nyssara of Highcrest, it is not a small thing to hear. They sat on opposite ends of that bench for another hour. Working, ostensibly. The maps turned. His blade rested across his knees and he did not pick it up again. At some point, I cannot pinpoint exactly when, the distance between them on the bench had reduced by approximately 6 inches. Neither of them remarked on it. Neither of them moved back. There are two kinds of dangerous people in this world. Those who act without thinking. And those who think so precisely, so completely, that they convince themselves they have accounted for everything. Nyssara was always the second kind. I knew something was happening 3 days before it happened. The signs were small. Small enough that someone less practiced in the art of watching might have missed them entirely. She began leaving the Eastern Library earlier than usual. Her evening walks along the fortress perimeter extended by 20 minutes, then 30. She stopped annotating her maps, which for Nyssara was the equivalent of a soldier setting down their weapon. She was not gathering information anymore. She was preparing to use it. On the 4th night I followed her. She left through the servants' corridor off the lower kitchen, a route she had mapped, I realized, during those early weeks when everyone assumed her stillness was passivity rather than reconnaissance. She wore a grey cloak that belonged to one of the kitchen women, borrowed or bartered, and she moved through the outer ward with the unhurried confidence of someone who had rehearsed the route until it lived in her feet rather than her head. I kept my distance. She crossed the secondary gate, unmanned at the 3rd bell, which she had also apparently noted, and descended the black stone path toward the valley's edge where Draekmar's cliffs give way to the tree line. The moon was thin that night. Considerate, almost. They were waiting in the tree line. 2 of them, Highcrest intelligence, not soldiers, which told me this had been arranged through channels her father either controlled entirely or did not know about at all. I could not yet determine which. One I recognized as a junior attaché from her original diplomatic party. The other I did not know. She greeted them without embrace. Straight to it. What is his current position, she said. Mobilized to the 2nd garrison, the attaché said. 40 days from the border at marching pace. He's waiting for a reason, my lady. He wants you to give him one. I'm going to give him the opposite. She produced a folded document from inside the cloak. A proposed ceasefire framework. Non-aggression along the Vethkara corridor in exchange for Draekmar's recognition of Highcrest's northern trade rights. It benefits both sides. He will see that. The attaché and the unknown man exchanged a look. She saw it. What? Lord General Varric, the attaché said carefully, has already drafted his own framework. A pause. Show me. My lady, I don't think. Show me. He produced his own document. She read it in the thin moonlight with the rapid focus of someone who reads the way others breathe. Automatically, completely. I watched her face as she moved through it. I have seen people receive bad news in many ways. Loudly, quietly, with anger or with tears or with the particular blankness of those who have always half expected the worst. Nyssara received it the way she received everything, by going very still and very precise, as though stillness were a form of armor that bad news could not penetrate if she held it correctly. Her father's framework did not mention ceasefire. It mentioned extraction. Her return to Highcrest, by force if necessary. Draekmar characterized as a hostile state holding a human national against her will. War framed not as aggression but as rescue. And at the bottom, in her father's hand. If she will not come willingly, she has already been lost. Act accordingly. She folded the document. Handed it back. He doesn't know you're here, she said. Not a question. The attaché hesitated 1 second too long. He sent you, she said quietly. I wrote. She trusted one person in this meeting. She has just discovered there was no one to trust. My lady. This was never a parley. Her voice was even. Devastatingly even. This was an assessment. You came to determine whether I would come willingly before he decides how to come for me. Neither man spoke. She looked at them both for a long moment, with the expression of someone closing a door they had kept open longer than was wise. Then she straightened, folded her own document back inside her cloak, and turned toward the fortress. Tell him, she said, without looking back, that I am exactly where I chose to be. She walked back through the tree line alone. I followed at my distance, watching the line of her shoulders in the grey cloak, straight, still, betraying nothing to the dark around her. But I was close enough, at one point, to see her press her scarred palm briefly against her sternum, as though something beneath it ached. The bond, perhaps. Or something older than the bond. The particular pain of understanding, finally and completely, that a parent sees you as a piece to be moved rather than a person to be known. She re-entered through the servants' corridor. Returned the cloak. Went to her chambers. I do not know how long she sat awake that night. I only know her light did not go out until nearly dawn. And I know that 2 floors below, Kaelrith's light was on as well, had been, I realized, since before she left. I wrote. He knew. I don't know how much. But he knew something. He let her go anyway. I have spent a long time deciding whether that was trust or strategy. I think, by that point, even he could no longer tell the difference. I have recorded betrayals in many forms. Political ones are the cleanest, transactional, logical, the natural conclusion of competing interests that were never truly aligned. Personal ones are messier. They carry the particular wreckage of something that was real before it was broken, and the breaking is always worse for the reality that preceded it. What Lord General Varric of Highcrest did to his daughter was neither clean nor messy. It was surgical. The summons arrived 2 days after the treeline meeting, delivered through the same channel as the attaché, which told Nyssara it had been planned before the meeting concluded, possibly before it began. A request for a second parley. Different location. Neutral ground, the message said, at the valley crossing 3 miles from Draekmar's outer gate. Neutral ground. As though her father had ever recognized the existence of neutral ground in his life. She went anyway. I have asked myself many times why. She was not naive, she had read his document in the moonlight, had understood with complete clarity what it meant. She knew the attaché had reported back. She knew the invitation was not what it claimed to be. I think she went because she needed to hear it from him directly. Because there is a particular cruelty in hope, the way it persists past the point of evidence, insisting on one more proof before it agrees to die. She needed him to show her, completely and without ambiguity, who he was. He obliged her. She arrived at the valley crossing with 2 of her own guard, Draekmar wolves she had been permitted as escort, a compromise Kaelrith had extracted from the elders 3 weeks prior without explaining why he wanted it. She would have gone alone otherwise. He had apparently calculated this. Varric's force was 40 strong. Armed. Positioned before she crested the ridge. She did not run. I want that recorded clearly. She saw the numbers, assessed the geometry, and did not run. She sat her horse in the thin morning light with the composure of someone who had always known the world was built to disappoint her and had simply been waiting to find out in which specific configuration. They took her guards first. Quickly, professionally, with the minimum of violence necessary to make the point. Then they surrounded her. Her father rode forward alone. I was in the ridge tree line, too far to hear the words, close enough to see everything that mattered. The shape of the conversation. The way Varric gestured, broad, commanding, the particular movements of a man delivering terms rather than engaging in dialogue. The way Nyssara sat perfectly still through all of it, her hands loose on the reins, her face turned toward him with an expression I recognized from the night she had read his document. A door closing. At some point he gestured to his soldiers. Two dismounted and approached her. She did not struggle when they took her reins. She did not speak, as far as I could see. She simply looked at her father with that closed-door expression until he looked away first. He looked away first. They bound her wrists, loosely, the kind of binding that is more statement than security, and turned her horse toward the Highcrest column. Before they moved, Varric rode close and said something directly to her, something short and deliberate that I will never know the content of. Whatever it was, she did not respond. They rode. I did not follow immediately. I stood in the tree line and thought about what I had just witnessed, and about what was happening 2 miles away in a stone fortress where a king was going about his morning unaware that the thread connecting him to the one person he had not yet admitted he could not afford to lose had just been pulled taut to its absolute limit. Then I felt it, even I felt it, and I carry none of the bond's blood. A shift in the air. A pressure change, the way the atmosphere compresses before lightning finds its ground. In Draekmar's training yard, Kaelrith had stopped mid-sequence. I was told later, by the senior captain who witnessed it, that he simply stopped. Bled mid-arc. Stood completely still for 3 seconds in the raked sand with the expression of a man receiving information through a channel that has no name in any language. Then he said, very quietly, "Where is she?" The captain did not know. No one in the yard knew. They had not been watching the valley crossing. Kaelrith dropped the blade. He did not run. Kings do not run in front of their soldiers. And even then, even in that moment, he understood the optics of himself. But he walked with the fast, absolute purpose of a man for whom every other item of business has just ceased to exist, and the captain told me later that none of them, not one soldier in that yard, considered following him without being summoned. There are moments when a person's grief is so precise it creates a perimeter around them. This was one of those moments. I arrived back at Draekmar's gates 20 minutes after Kaelrith had already been told. His 2 escort wolves had managed to send word ahead before being detained, a piece of professionalism I suspect Nyssara had quietly insisted on before the situation made insistence impossible. I found Kaelrith in the map room. He was standing at the table where she had first set down her father's diplomatic petition, where she had later spread her annotated supply maps, where they had sat in silence together over documents neither of them had been reading, and where the distance between them had quietly, incrementally, refused to stay the size they kept assigning it. He was not looking at the maps. He was looking at the table. Elder Vane stood in the doorway behind him, which required a particular kind of courage I had not previously credited her with. "The council convenes in 1 hour," she said, "to discuss response options." Kaelrith said nothing. "The bond," Vane continued carefully, "will begin to destabilize within." "I know what it will do," he said. His voice was even. Completely, absolutely even. The kind of even that is not calm but is the thing that exists on the other side of calm. Past it, in territory that has its own weather. Vane withdrew. I stayed. I am a witness. It is the only credential I carry. He stood at that table for a long time. And I watched the thing he had been administering away for weeks, the thing he had chained himself against during the full moon, had redirected into supply logistics and training yard adjustments and the deliberate middle distance of a bench in a winter yard. I watched it move through him with nowhere left to go. Not loudly. Not with the theater he would never permit himself. Just, thoroughly. I wrote. Her father called her misguided. He bound her wrists loosely enough that she could have worked free, and she didn't, because escape was never the point. She needed him to show her who he was. He showed her. And 2 miles away, in a room full of her handwriting, a king who had spent years sealing himself against exactly this discovered that the seal had already failed. He just hadn't been told yet. War has a sound before it has a shape. I have heard it many times, the particular frequency of a decision made at the level where calculation ends and something older begins. It moves through an army differently than orders do. Orders travel down a chain. This travels sideways, simultaneously, the way fire moves through dry grass when the wind has already decided. Draekmar heard it the morning Kaelrith walked into the war council and did not sit down. He stood at the head of the table the way he had stood at the base of his throne on the night I first saw him, not as ceremony, but as warning. The generals and senior alphas arranged around the table read it immediately. I watched them straighten, one by one, like instruments being tuned to a frequency they recognized in their bones. Elder Sorvan spoke first, which was either bravery or a failure to read the room. The council's position is that measured retaliation along the border. I am not retaliating, Kaelrith said. Silence. My king, Sorvan continued carefully, a full invasion carries political consequences that measured. Write them down, Kaelrith said. Every consequence. I will read them when we return. The room absorbed this. Senior General Aldrich, a grey-muzzled alpha who had fought beside Kaelrith in the border wars and therefore understood the specific register he was currently operating in, leaned forward. What are our objectives? Highcrest's outer garrison. Then the second. Then the capital if necessary. And the end condition. Kaelrith looked at him. You know the end condition. Aldrich held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, with the expression of a man confirming something he had suspected since the morning's first report arrived. Mobilization timeline, he said, reaching for his maps. I wrote. He did not say her name. He did not need to. Every person in that room understood what they were being asked to march toward, and not one of them, not even Routh, who had wanted war for entirely different reasons, raised an objection. There is something clarifying about a king who stops pretending. The mobilization took 4 hours. I have witnessed Draekmar prepare for war before. It is an efficient, practice machine, every component knowing its function without being told twice. But there was a different quality to it that morning. Faster. Tighter. The particular energy of an army that is not fighting for territory or ideology or the cold strategic imperatives that generals write about in memoirs. They were fighting for something their king wanted back. Pack animals understand that differently than humans do. For wolves, the distinction between personal and political does not exist in the way human courts pretend it does. A king's mate is pack. Pack is defended. The calculation is that simple, and the simplicity of it moved through Draekmar's ranks like a second mobilization order, unspoken, requiring no chain of command. I watched it happen from the inner courtyard as the units formed. The quality of their readiness. The way they checked each other's equipment with more thoroughness than usual. The absence of the dark humor soldiers used to metabolize fear before a campaign. They were not afraid. They were focused. Kaelrith emerged from the fortress in full war armor, black steel, moonforged, the crescent insignia of the Blood Moon throne at his chest. He had worn it before. I had seen accounts of it. But there is a difference between a king who puts on armor because war requires it and a king who puts on armor because he has run out of reasons not to. He mounted without ceremony. Aldrich rode up beside him. The border garrison will expect a flanking approach through the Vethkara Pass. Standard Draekmar entry pattern. We're not using the pass. Aldrich looked at him. The alternative route adds 6 hours. The alternative route, Kaelrith said, was identified as a vulnerability 3 weeks ago. Highcrest doesn't know we've closed it. We come through there and they have no prepared position. A pause. She found that, Aldrich said carefully. She did. Another pause, longer. The men should know that. The men, Kaelrith said, already know. He was right. I had heard it moving through the ranks during mobilization, quietly, passed between soldiers in the particular shorthand of people who understand the significance of what they are relaying. The route she had identified. The supply lines she had restructured. The pivot adjustment in the training yard that 3 of the senior soldiers had already credited to her in conversation with their units. She had made Draekmar's army better. And Draekmar's army was going to war for her. I found Elder Routh at the outer gate as the column began to move. He was watching with an expression I had not seen on him before, not the restless ambition of the council chamber, but something more complicated. Something that looked almost like reassessment. His not fighting for the throne, Routh said, to no one in particular. No, I agreed, before remembering I was not supposed to be there. He glanced at me with the unsurprised expression of someone who has accepted that certain things exist in Draekmar that do not require explanation. He'll burn Highcrest to the ground. Probably. For her. Yes. Routh was quiet for a moment. Then, she fixed the Northern Pass vulnerability. She did. He nodded slowly. The expression on his face completed its journey from ambition to something that resembled, distantly, respect. The column moved through Draekmar's gate in the grey morning light, thousands of wolves, moon-forged steel, the blood moon banner catching the wind at the front of the line. Kaelrith rode at the head, not in the protected center where military convention places commanders of consequence. At the head. Aldrich rode beside him, maps across his saddle, already working through the approach logistics with the professional focus of a general who has accepted his orders and will execute them with everything he has. I watched them go from the gate. I wrote, I have seen Kaelrith of Draekmar go to war before, in the accounts and the aftermath and the silence that battlefields leave behind them. I had not seen him go to war like this. There is a version of this story where he is the butcher of the border wars, cold, strategic, untouchable. That version ended somewhere between a training yard bench and a tree line at dawn. What rode out of Draekmar that morning was something the border wars had never produced. A king who had stopped fighting for territory. A wolf who knew exactly what he was going to get back. Highcrest builds everything to be seen. Where Draekmar carves itself into cliffs and black stone, content to be felt rather than observed, Highcrest constructs upward, towers, ramparts, platforms, the deliberate architecture of a state that understands power as performance. Every public space is designed with sightlines in mind. Every sightline is designed with an audience in mind. The execution platform in Highcrest's central square was no exception. It was old. Older than Varric's tenure, older than the current iteration of the war between their peoples. The stone was worn smooth at the edges from decades of boots and weather, and the iron rings set into its face had been replaced twice in living memory. It was not a place built for quiet endings. It was built to be witnessed. Varric understood this instinctively. He had chosen the location before he had chosen the charge. I arrived in Highcrest 2 days ahead of Draekmar's column, which required methods I will not detail here. What matters is that I was in the square when they brought her out. She had been held in the garrison's upper cells, not the dungeons, which told me Varric was still navigating something complicated in his own mind about what she was to him. A prisoner of war. A diplomatic failure. A daughter. He had not yet resolved the categories, and the upper cell was the physical expression of that irresolution. Uncomfortable enough to signal displeasure. Livable enough to signal something he would not name. She had been there 4 days when they brought her out. She looked like herself. That is not a small thing to say under the circumstances. 4 days of captivity, bound wrists, a father's document burned into her memory, and she descended the garrison steps into the grey Highcrest morning looking like a woman who had spent the time deciding something rather than enduring something. Her hair was unbound, which I suspect was not her preference but which she had accepted without making it a crisis. Her hands were still loosely bound in front of her. She had not worked free of them, and I understood why. Escape was still not the point. The square was full. Varric had ensured it. Soldiers lined the perimeter. Citizens pressed into the middle distance, the way they do when they have been informed that attendance is expected and have correctly interpreted what that means. And at the front, closest to the platform, a row of Highcrest nobles and military officers arranged in the formal configuration of those required to witness. Varric stood on the platform already. Full regalia. The Lord General's iron seal at his chest, the formal sword at his hip that he had not worn in active combat in 11 years. He was performing the role of a man who has made a difficult but necessary decision, and performing it for the specific audience of history rather than the crowd in front of him. They brought her up the steps. She did not need to be guided. She walked ahead of her escort, which threw their choreography slightly. They had rehearsed leading her, and she had declined to be led. A small thing. She did it anyway. She stopped at the platform center and looked out at the square. Not at her father. At the crowd. She looked at them the way she looked at everything, taking inventory, cataloging, understanding the room before she decided what to do inside it. Then she looked at Varric. He spoke for some time. I was at a distance and the acoustics of the square worked against me, but I caught the shape of it, the formal charges, the language of treason dressed in the vocabulary of protection. He was telling the story of a daughter misled, a human woman compromised by Lycan influence, a rescue that had been refused and therefore necessitated this. He was building a narrative that would survive the day regardless of its outcome. He was very good at it. He had been doing it his entire career. When he finished, the square was silent with the held breath of a crowd that has been told what to feel and is waiting to receive the cue. Varric looked at his daughter. "Renounce your association with Draekmar," he said, loudly enough for the square to carry it. "Denounce the Lycan throne. Return to Highcrest's protection, and this matter is resolved." A pause. She looked at him for a long moment with that closed-door expression, the one I had first seen in the valley crossing, the one that meant she had finished hoping for something and had moved on to what came next. Then she turned to face the crowd rather than her father. "I was sent to Draekmar as a diplomat," she said. Her voice carried without effort. She had been raised in war councils, trained to speak in rooms that did not want to hear her, and she understood projection as a form of armor. "I was sent to gather intelligence and return it to Highcrest. Those were my orders. I understood them." The square was absolutely still. "I am not renouncing Draekmar," she said. "I am not denouncing its throne. And I am not returning to anyone's protection." She looked at her father then, directly, without flinching, without the performance of defiance that would have made it smaller than it was. "I was never yours to command. You raised me to understand strategy. This is mine." Varric's expression did not change. But something behind it did. "You are choosing them," he said, quietly enough that it was almost private. "Almost." "I am choosing myself," she replied. "That you cannot distinguish between the two is precisely the problem." The square absorbed this. Varric looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment, before he reassembled the Lord General's face over whatever was underneath it, I saw something that I recorded and have not shared with anyone until now. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has already decided to destroy because he cannot figure out how to deserve it. Then he nodded to the guard at her left. The guard drew his blade. "I wrote." She did not close her eyes. "I want that recorded." She stood on that platform in the grey Highcrest morning with her hands bound and her father's order hanging in the air between them, and she did not close her eyes. She was still looking at him when the blade came up. She was still looking at him when the sound reached the square's eastern edge. Not the blade. Something else. Something that had been traveling since dawn through a route that Highcrest had not prepared for. Identified 3 weeks ago by a woman standing in a training yard with ink-stained fingers and a question mark on her parchment. Draekmar had arrived. I have thought carefully about how to record this chapter. Not because I lack the words. Because some moments resist the economy of language. They are too dense, too layered, too many things occurring simultaneously in too many registers for linear recording to do them justice. A witness can only follow one thread at a time. I have chosen to follow the one that mattered most. I chose him. Draekmar's entry through Highcrest's unprepared eastern flank took 11 minutes. I know because I counted. The route Nyssara had identified, the vulnerability window, the terrain inconsistency in the older surveys, the approach that Highcrest had left unfortified because they did not know Draekmar had found it, opened the city's defense like a hand opening. Clean. Decisive. The work of intelligence applied with precision. Her intelligence. His army. The square was chaos by the time Kaelrith reached it. Highcrest soldiers had moved to intercept the eastern breach, pulling from their perimeter positions, which collapsed the crowd containment and turned the central square into a moving confusion of bodies seeking exits. The nobles had scattered. The officers had drawn weapons and were attempting to form a defensive line against something that does not form the way human soldiers expect. Through all of it the platform stood. Varric was still on it. The guard with the blade was still beside Nyssara. In the chaos of the square's collapse he had not moved, whether from discipline or from the specific paralysis of a man whose orders have just become irrelevant and who has not yet received new ones, I cannot say. Nyssara had not moved either. She was watching the eastern edge of the square. She knew the route. She had drawn it. And so when the first Draekmar wolf came through the eastern archway, she was already looking at exactly the right place, and when the column followed and the square understood what was happening, she was the stillest person in it. I watched her face when she saw him. Kaelrith came through the square on foot. He had dismounted at the archway, which told me he had anticipated the crowd density and made the calculation in real time. He moved through the chaos with the focused economy of a man who has reduced the entire world to a single coordinate and is navigating toward it. He was not looking at Varric. He was not assessing the defensive lines or monitoring his general's positions. He was looking at the platform. At her. At the blade still at her side. The guard registered Kaelrith's approach 6 seconds before it became a crisis and made the decision, whether from fear or from a final, desperate adherence to his orders, to act on the timeline he had been given before the timeline became impossible. The blade moved. She turned into it rather than away, a reflex, I think, the trained instinct of someone who has spent years in war councils understanding that you do not show your back to a threat. It caught her along the left side, below the ribs, deep enough to matter. She went down. Not dramatically. Not the way stories are told. She simply stopped being upright, her legs making the practical decision before the rest of her had finished processing, and she was on the platform boards with her bound hands pressed to her side and her face doing the thing faces do when the body has announced something the mind is not ready to accept. Kaelrith made a sound. I will not try to describe it. I have no adequate frame of reference. It was not a battle cry, and it was not grief, and it was not the controlled authority of a king issuing commands. It was the sound of something that had been held under enormous pressure for a very long time finally finding the crack it had been looking for. He reached the platform in seconds. The guard did not survive those seconds. Then he was beside her, on his knees on the worn platform stone, which is a thing I watched with my own eyes and will record plainly because plainness is the only appropriate register for a moment this unadorned. Kaelrith of Draekmar, the butcher of the border wars, the king who had not knelt to anyone in living memory, on his knees on a Highcrest execution platform with his hands moving to her wound with the careful urgency of someone trying to hold something together that he is terrified of losing. Nyssara. Just her name. No title. No command in it, no political weight, nothing that belonged to the throne or the bond or the moon covenant or the war currently resolving itself in the square around them. Just the name, the way you say the name of something you have been trying not to need. She looked at him. Her face was pale and precise and doing the thing it always did, cataloguing, assessing, calculating. Even then. Even there. I loved her for it, in the way a witness loves the subjects who do not perform for them. You used the eastern route, she said. Yes. It worked. Yes. She exhaled slowly. Her hands were still pressed to her side, his over hers now, both of them applying pressure with the shared practicality of people who understand wounds. Around them the square was resolving, Draekmar wolves securing perimeter, Highcrest soldiers standing down with the specific posture of men who have run the numbers and found them conclusive. Varric was somewhere behind them. I did not look at him. I kept my eyes on the platform. The bond, she said. Her voice was even but costing her something to keep even. I felt it. I felt it in you. I know. You felt me. From the training yard, he said quietly. The morning they took you. She absorbed this. Her eyes moved across his face with the focused attention she gave to documents she was reading for the second time, looking for what she had missed on the first pass. You let me go to the tree line, she said. Yes. You knew it was a trap. I suspected. And you let me go anyway. He met her gaze steadily. You needed to see it for yourself. I understood that. Something moved across her face. Not the closed-door expression. Something that had been behind the door. That was, she started. Nyssara. His voice dropped. Stay with me. The argument can happen later. Her mouth curved slightly at the corner. Faint. Real. You're assuming I'll be well enough to argue. You will be, he said, with a certainty that had nothing strategic in it. He gathered her carefully, her bound hands, her careful stillness, the grey cloak that wasn't hers still around her shoulders, and lifted her from the platform boards with the focused gentleness of someone handling something irreplaceable. She did not tell him she could walk. She did not insist on her own capability or reframe the moment as anything other than what it was. She let him carry her. I recorded that too. Because I understood what it cost her, and what it meant that she paid it. I wrote, the bond weakened when she fell. I felt it, that pressure drop, that held breath absence, the thread going dangerously slack between them. The elders would tell me later that Kaelrith had felt it like a blade, which is perhaps why the guard did not survive. But she did not slip away. I think she decided not to. I think she heard her name, just her name, nothing attached to it, no title or political weight or ancient decree, and decided that the person saying it was worth the effort of staying. I have no evidence for this. I believe it anyway. Below the platform, in the settling chaos of a square that had witnessed more than it had been arranged to witness, Elder Aldrich was coordinating the securing of Highcrest's command structure. Varric had been taken without resistance. He had watched his daughter carried from the platform and something in him had simply stopped, the way a mechanism stops when its central purpose is removed. He did not look like a Lord General. He looked like a father who had run out of narratives. I did not record his expression. Some things are too private even for a witness. Victory smells like ash. I do not mean that poetically. I mean it literally, the particular combination of extinguished torches, cold stone, and the aftermath of momentum that has nowhere left to go. I have stood in the center of enough won battles to know the scent precisely. It is not triumphant. It is not satisfying. It is simply what remains when the thing you are moving toward stops requiring you to move. Draekmar's forces secured Highcrest's capital by nightfall. It was not a brutal occupation. Kaelrith had given specific orders that I suspect surprised his generals with their precision. No civilian casualties beyond the unavoidable. No looting. Command structures preserved where possible for the administrative transition that would need to follow. The Highcrest officers who surrendered were housed in the garrison's upper levels, treated with the particular Draekmar courtesy that is indistinguishable from threat because it requires no cruelty to communicate its terms. Varric was held separately, in the upper cell where Nyssara had spent 4 days. I do not know if that was deliberate. I suspect it was. Kaelrith did not oversee any of it. He had carried her to the field physician station established at Highcrest's eastern gate, the first infrastructure Draekmar had set up upon entry, which told me it had been planned in advance, which told me he had been planning for the possibility of this since before he left. He had set her down on the physician's table and stepped back exactly far enough to be out of the way and no further, and he had remained there while the wound was assessed and cleaned and dressed with the focused stillness of a man performing stillness as an act of will. The physician, a Draekmar wolf named Sora who had the efficient manner of someone who has treated battlefield wounds long enough to find drama counterproductive, had looked at him once during the procedure with an expression that communicated several things without words. That the wound was serious. That it had been caught in time. That the king's presence directly behind her left shoulder was noted and she would appreciate 6 additional inches of workspace. He gave her 4. When it was done, when Nyssara had been moved to a secured room in Highcrest's inner garrison, her rooms, the ones she had been held in, which Sora had selected for their quality and Kaelrith had permitted without remarking on the location, he had gone to the window and stood there. He was still standing there when I arrived. The room was quiet. Nyssara was asleep, genuine sleep, not unconsciousness, which Sora had confirmed before leaving with the brisk satisfaction of someone whose work has concluded well. The wound had been deep but clean. Rest and time and the bond's own tendency to knit what it valued would do the remaining work. She had told him this. He had nodded. He had not moved from the window. I found my place near the door and watched him watch the city. Highcrest at night, under Draekmar's occupation, was a city holding its breath. Lights in the windows, people behind them who did not know yet what their lives were going to look like, waiting to find out. The garrison bell marking the hour with the mechanical indifference of a thing that does not understand what has changed. Below, the soft movement of Draekmar's perimeter wolves making their rounds through streets that still smelled of someone else's history. He had won. Every military objective met. The route she had identified. The supply restructuring she had designed. The approach that Highcrest had never fortified. The war he had gone to fight was over, and it was over in a single day, which was not something any of his previous campaigns could claim. He stood at the window of the room where she was sleeping and looked like a man who had forgotten what winning was for. I wrote, "This is what they do not tell you about people who have spent years sealing themselves. The seal does not break all at once. It develops fractures, small ones, incremental, each one purchased by something that got through. And then one day the thing you were most afraid of losing is lying 10 feet behind you breathing shallowly in a garrison bed, and the seal is simply gone. And you are standing at a window in a conquered city with nothing left to administer your grief into. At some point, past the second bell, closer to the third, she woke. I knew because her breathing changed, and because Kaelrith turned from the window without any visible cue, the way the bonded do when something shifts in the thread between them. He crossed the room and sat in the chair beside her bed that had been placed there by someone on his staff who had apparently decided this was not a night to make the king ask for furniture. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then at him. "Did we win?" she said. "Yes." "Casualties?" "Manageable. Fewer than projected." She absorbed this. Her eyes moved to the window, to the occupied city beyond it, and I watched her do the thing she could not stop herself doing even now. Cataloging, assessing, running the numbers on what came next. The administrative transition will need. Nyssara. She stopped. He was looking at her with an expression that had nothing administrative in it. Nothing strategic. Nothing that belonged to thrones or wars or the ancient decree that had started all of this. He looked at her the way a man looks when he has run out of the language he was trained to use and must attempt something in a tongue he has never been taught. "I refuse to claim you," he said, "because I believed that wanting something was the same as giving your enemies the means to destroy you." A pause. Long enough to cost him something. I have believed that since before you were born. It is the only truth I have governed by. She said nothing. She was listening with her whole self, the way she did when information mattered. The night they took you, he continued, I stood in the map room and understood that the belief was already broken. That it had been breaking for weeks, in a training yard, over supply maps, in a silence on a bench that kept refusing to stay the size I assigned it. He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. I had been losing you since before I admitted you were something I could lose. The room held the silence between them with the old stone patience of a place that has witnessed more than it will ever be asked to explain. You were afraid, she said. Not an accusation. A recognition. Yes. Of the bond failing. Of you, he said plainly. Of what you had already become before I had decided to permit it. She looked at him for a long time. The closed-door expression was gone, had been gone, I realized, since the platform. What was behind the door was quieter than I had expected. More exhausted. More real. I came here to gather intelligence, she said. I know. I intended to leave. I know. I stopped intending that somewhere around the 3rd week. She paused. I did not tell you because I had not finished being angry about it. Something moved through his expression, not quite amusement, not quite relief, but occupying the territory between them with a warmth I had not seen on his face before and which looked, I thought, like something he had not worn in a very long time. Are you finished being angry about it? He said. She considered this with appropriate seriousness. Not entirely. That seems fair. She exhaled slowly. Her hand moved across the blanket, not reaching, not performing, simply moving toward the general direction of where his was resting on the chair's arm. He met it the rest of the way. Her scarred palm against his fingers. No blood this time. No decree. No ancient mechanic deciding for them. Just a choice, made in a quiet room in a conquered city, by 2 people who had run out of reasons to make any other one. I wrote, victory smells like ash. But the room smelled like something else entirely. I did not record what. Some things are not for witnesses. She slept for 2 days. Not the shallow, watchful half-sleep of someone managing pain. The deep, surrendered sleep of a body that has been running on will for so long that the moment will releases its grip, everything underneath it simply stops. Sora checked on her every 6 hours with the professional thoroughness of someone who does not require the king to ask. Kaelrith did not ask. He was there each time anyway. I will not record everything those 2 days contained. Some of it was not mine to witness, the private arithmetic of a man sitting beside a bed in a conquered city, recalculating everything he had built his governance around against the evidence of the past 6 weeks. I caught fragments. The way he read her annotated maps, brought from Draekmar at his order before the column had even departed. The way he held them with more care than he held most things. The way he did not leave the room. On the morning of the 3rd day she woke with her eyes open before the rest of her had caught up, the abrupt, fully conscious waking of someone trained to orient immediately. She looked at the ceiling, then the window, then him. He was in the chair. He had not slept in it, or not much. The chair had the look of something that had been occupied with focused purpose rather than rest. You're still here, she said. Yes. She considered this. Outside the window Highcrest was beginning its day with the cautious normalcy of a city still deciding what normalcy meant under new conditions. Market sounds. Bell in the distance. The specific texture of people resuming their lives because lives require resuming regardless of what has interrupted them. How long, she said. 2 days. She absorbed this without comment, which I had learned was her version of being moved by something. She looked at the window. At the city. At the light coming through at the angle that meant mid-morning. My father, she said. Held. Unharmed. The council will need a transition framework. Highcrest's administrative structure can't simply. Nyssara. She stopped. Looked at him. Later, he said. A pause. I'm trying to be practical. I know. Later. She looked at him for a moment longer, that second-read expression, looking for what she had missed on the first pass. Then she settled back against the pillow with the careful movement of someone negotiating with a wound and appeared, for perhaps the first time since I had begun recording her, to simply stop. No cataloging. No assessment. No maps to annotate or vulnerabilities to identify. She lay in the garrison bed in the city her father had ruled and looked at the ceiling and breathed. I wrote, I have watched her since the moment she rode through Draekmar's gate. I have never seen her be still before. Not like this. Every other stillness she has performed was a form of calculation, wearing stillness as a coat. This was different. This was actual rest. And it cost her something to allow it, which meant it was also a kind of trust. After a while she said, without looking away from the ceiling, you said you feared me. Yes. Specifically me. Not the bond. The bond one understood. You I did not. A pause. You were not a variable I had a category for. She considered this. That's almost a compliment. It was intended as an explanation. For a man of few words, you've been remarkably forthcoming in the past 3 days. You were unconscious for 2 of them. Her mouth curved at the corner. That faint, real thing I had seen on the platform. So this is easier when I can't argue back. Considerably, he said. She almost laughed. It didn't quite complete itself. The wound made a full laugh inadvisable and she knew it, but the shape of it was there, in her face, in the exhale that followed. I recorded it carefully. I did not want to lose the detail. She turned her head to look at him then. Properly, without the second-read assessment. Just looking. I stopped intending to leave, she said. I told you that. You did. I meant it. I know. I need you to know that it wasn't the bond. Her voice was even but carrying something beneath the evenness, the particular weight of someone saying the thing they have been most careful not to say. The bond is, I feel it. I have felt it since the feast. But what I stopped intending to leave for was not the bond. A pause. I want that distinction understood. He looked at her for a long moment. I refuse to claim you, he said, because the bond felt like something that had been decided for me, and I have spent my life refusing things decided for me. He paused. What I feel is not the bond, Nyssara. The bond is a fact. What I feel is something I arrived at myself, which is the only kind of thing I have ever known how to trust. She held his gaze. You were already losing me, she said quietly, by refusing. I know. The words landed with the weight of someone who had understood this for longer than he had been willing to admit. I was losing you and choosing to call it strategy. Was it strategy? No, he said. It was fear with better vocabulary. The room was very quiet. Outside, Highcrest continued its cautious resumption of ordinary life. Inside, 2 people sat in the particular silence of those who have said the true things and are now simply present in the aftermath of having said them, where there is nothing left to manage and nowhere left to retreat to. Her hand was still on the blanket. He reached across from the chair and covered it with his. The same gesture as the night before, unhurried, without ceremony. She turned her palm upward beneath his. The scar caught the morning light. So did the faint markings along his veins, the bond's evidence, patient and undemanding, waiting as it had always waited for them to stop finding reasons to refuse it. When I'm well enough, she said. Yes. We go back to Draekmar. Yes. And then. He was quiet for a moment. Not the strategic quiet, the other kind. The kind that means something is being felt rather than calculated. And then, he said, I intend to do something I should have done at the beginning, when the elders demanded it and I refused on the grounds that I was not ready. She looked at him steadily. And now? Now, he said, I am not claiming you because blood demands it or law requires it or because the pack needs the optics of a stable throne. His thumb moved once across her scarred palm. I am claiming you because I cannot imagine the map room without your annotations. Because you fixed my northern pass vulnerability and argued with my archiving system and sat on a bench in a winter yard until the distance between us became a problem I stopped wanting to solve. A pause. Because you stepped in front of a blade for me before you had decided to. She was quiet for a moment. That last part wasn't a compliment, she said. It was the most important thing, he said. That it was instinct. Before ideology. Before calculation. He met her eyes. You were already mine before either of us had agreed to it. I am simply, finally, agreeing to it. She looked at him for a long time. Outside the city breathed. Inside the room the morning light moved across the floor in the slow, indifferent way of light that has no stake in what it illuminates. Kaelrith, she said. Yes. Stop talking. He stopped. She shifted carefully, making room on the narrow garrison bed with the pragmatic efficiency of a woman who has made her decision and sees no reason to be sentimental about the logistics. He looked at the space she had made, then at her. The physician said rest, he said. I am resting, she said. Come here. He came. Not as a king. Not as a mate claiming what the bond had designated his. Simply as a man who had been sitting in a chair for 2 days at a careful distance from something he loved and had finally, completely, run out of reasons to maintain the distance. He sat beside her on the narrow bed. She settled against him with the unself-conscious ease of someone who has come home to a place they did not know they had been looking for. His arm came around her. Carefully. Deliberately. She put her scarred palm against his chest, above where the bond markings traced their patient lines along his skin, and closed her eyes. I wrote, he said, I was already losing you. By refusing. She said, I know. And I understood then that this was the real confession, not the claiming, not the admission of fear, not the words that would come later in the great hall before pack and witness and history. This was it. Here. In a narrow garrison bed in a conquered city, with a wound healing between them and a city outside deciding what came next. 2 people who had run out of ways to be apart. I closed my notebook. Some endings are not for recording. Some are simply for living. They returned to Draekmar on a Tuesday. I note the day because it matters to me, not politically, not historically, but personally, in the way that witnesses develop attachments to the details that powerful people overlook. Tuesdays in Draekmar carry a specific quality of light. The sun comes in at an angle that turns the black stone briefly amber, and the fortress loses for an hour the quality of something built to intimidate and becomes instead simply a place where people live. It was a good day for what was about to happen. The column rode in through the main gate, Draekmar's wolves first, then the formal contingent, then Kaelrith and Nyssara side by side at a pace that was neither hurried nor ceremonial but simply the pace of 2 people arriving somewhere together. The captured Highcrest nobles followed behind under respectful escort, their presence required not as humiliation but as witness. Kaelrith had been precise about this distinction in his orders. I had noted it. The pack was assembled in the outer yard. All of them, the inner court, the elders, the soldiers who had ridden to Highcrest and the ones who had remained behind to hold Draekmar in their absence, the wolves from the outer keeps who had ridden through the night when word reached them that the king was returning with the bondmate he had finally stopped refusing. They filled the yard and the ramparts above it and the archways beyond, and the collective weight of their attention had a physical quality, like pressure before a weather change. Nyssara rode into it without flinching. I watched her take in the assembled pack with the swift inventory of someone reading a room she has not been in before and finding it, on balance, manageable. She sat her horse with the straight-backed composure she carried everywhere, the thing she had been trained into so deeply it had become indistinguishable from her actual self. Though I had seen, in a narrow garrison bed in a conquered city, what existed beneath it. Both things were true. I had learned that about her. Kaelrith dismounted first. Then he turned and offered his hand, not as assistance, precisely, but as something more deliberate. A choice made publicly before the public moment had officially begun. She looked at his hand for a fraction of a second. Then she took it and dismounted, and did not release it when her feet found the ground. The yard was absolutely silent. They walked to the center together. The pack opened for them the way water opens, naturally, without being directed, the instinctive response of a collective that had already made its assessment and was now waiting for the formal confirmation of what it had decided. The elders stood at the yard's head. Sorvan at center, Vane at his right, Ralph, and I noted this, at his left, which was a position of formal support rather than opposition. Something had shifted in him during the campaign. I had watched it begin at the gate when the column departed. It had completed itself somewhere on the road back. Sorvan looked at them both for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. This was not the scripted part of the ritual. Sorvan stepping aside was not in the ancient decree. It was an elder who had spent 40 years governing by precedent choosing, for perhaps the first time, to let something be larger than the precedent. I wrote, he is old enough to know the difference between law and meaning. Today he chose meaning. Kaelrith turned to face Nyssara. She faced him. Around them the pack held its collective breath, thousands of years of ritual and instinct and moon-forged tradition pressing in from every side, and at the center of it 2 people standing close enough that the bond between them had stopped aching and simply settled. The way a held note settles when the instrument finally allows it. He reached for his belt knife. The same one he had carried since before the border wars, worn handle, the blade kept in a condition that communicated it was used rather than displayed. He held it for a moment. Then he looked at her. Not at the crowd. Not at the elders. Not at the Highcrest nobles arranged at the yard's edge with the expressions of people who have arrived at an event they did not expect to find meaningful and are discovering, against their intentions, that it is. At her. "I want to say something first," he said. His voice carried across the silent yard without effort, not because he projected it but because the yard had gone so quiet that ordinary speech became architecture. "The decree does not require words," he continued. "Blood and intent are sufficient under the Moon Covenant. I have been informed of this by the elders on multiple occasions." A pause, brief and dry, that drew something from the assembled pack that was not quite humor but was adjacent to it. "I am speaking anyway." Nyssara watched him with the expression I had come to know as her most unguarded, the one she wore when she had stopped managing how she appeared and was simply present. "I refuse to claim you," he said, "because I understood the bond as something that had happened to me. A decree. A mechanic. A fact of blood that existed outside my jurisdiction." He paused. "I was wrong. Not about the bond is real. I was wrong about what mattered. The yard. The amber light. The black stone, briefly something other than itself. What matters," he said, "is not that your blood touched mine. It is that you stepped between me and a blade before you had decided to. That you stayed when I offered you passage home. That you fixed my northern pass and argued with my elders and sat in a winter yard until the distance between us became a problem neither of us solved." His voice was even, but carrying something beneath the evenness that the whole yard could hear. "What matters is that I went to war not for territory, not for the throne, not for any of the reasons I have gone to war before. I went because you were somewhere I could not reach you, and that was the only fact that mattered." He turned his palm upward. Drew the blade. "I claim Nyssara of Highcrest," he said, "not because blood demands it. Not because law requires it. Not because the bond has left me no alternative." The cut was clean, deliberate, a line across the heel of his palm. "I claim her because I choose her. Above throne. Above strategy. Above every wall I built to keep this from being possible." He looked at her. "Above pride." The last two words landed quietly, precisely. The admission of a man who has spent his life treating pride as infrastructure and has just chosen to build something else instead. Nyssara looked at him for a long moment. Then she took the knife from his hand. The yard made a sound, not quite a gasp, not quite silence, but the specific collective response of a group witnessing something that was not in the script and which is better for it. She held the blade for a moment, looking at it, then at her already scarred palm. "You should know," she said, loud enough to carry, "that I am not claiming Draekmar's throne because blood bound me to it. Or because my alternatives were limited." She looked at the elders, at the pack, at the Highcrest nobles standing at the yard's edge. "I am claiming it because I have examined its logistics and its border strategies and its archiving system, which remains inadequate, and I believe it can be governed well." A pause. "And because the man who holds it went to war for me in a way that I intend to spend considerable time making inconvenient for him." Something moved through the yard. Warm, collective, entirely unscripted. She drew the blade across her scar, pressed her palm to his. Their blood, the same blood that had mixed 6 weeks ago on the stone floor of a feast hall, that had ignited a bond neither of them had asked for and both of them had, in their different ways, needed, met again. Not in accident this time. Not in instinct. In choice. The bond markings along Kaelrith's veins flared, visible even in daylight, a blue-silver light that moved from his hand upward, and the pack saw it, and the sound that went through them was old and certain and had nothing administrative in it. The Moon Covenant, completed at last. Not by decree. By decision. He closed his fingers around her hand. She closed hers around his. Their joined hands between them, blood and scar and 6 weeks of refusing and fighting and fixing each other's vulnerabilities and sitting on benches in winter yards. He did not kneel. I want to record this clearly, because the story will be told many ways in the years that follow and some tellings will add theatre that wasn't there. He did not kneel dramatically, did not make it a performance. What he did was this. He brought their joined hands to his lips, briefly, with the focused reverence of someone honoring something they had nearly lost through their own stubbornness. Then he straightened. And turned with her to face the pack. The wolves of Draekmar knelt. Not uniformly, not with the precision of a rehearsed movement, one by one and then in waves, the way the sea responds to a change in pressure, until the yard was full of bent heads and the amber light moved across all of it and the black stone fortress held the moment in its old, patient walls. The Highcrest nobles did not kneel. But I watched several of them, the ones who had been in the square, who had seen the platform and what came after, stand a little differently than they had arrived. Nyssara stood beside him. Not a step behind. Not ceremonially arranged. Beside him, their joined hands between them, her scarred palm against his, equal in the way that had nothing to do with decree and everything to do with the particular 6 weeks that had preceded this moment. I wrote, "This is where I should end." With the kneeling pack and the amber light and the two of them standing at the center of everything that tried to prevent this. But I am a witness, not a storyteller, and witnesses record what is true rather than what is tidy. What is true is this. She never became Draekmar. He never became Highcrest. They remained, stubbornly, completely, themselves. And they built something in the space between those selves that neither of them could have built alone. What is true is that the archiving system was overhauled within the month, and the northern pass vulnerability was fully closed by winter, and the elders learned, slowly and not without resistance, what it meant to be governed by two people who had each decided the other was worth the risk. What is true is that he still goes quiet in war councils, and she still annotates everything, and sometimes in the training yard at midday there are two people on a bench with the comfortable closeness of those who have stopped assigning distances. What is true is that I watched all of it. From the first execution in a stone hall, to the feast where blood chose for them, through every full moon and political fracture and winter yard morning and conquered city dawn. I watched a ruthless king discover that the crack his enemies could exploit had nothing to do with weakness. It had to do with her. And she was worth every fracture. I close my record here. Not because the story ends. Because some things, once chosen, no longer need a witness. They only need time. Before you leave, I need to know something. If you were Kaelrith, would you have claimed her the moment the blood bound you? Or would you have done what he did, and risked losing her forever? Tell me in the comments, claim immediately, or resist the bond. And Pack, if this story made your chest ache even once tonight, stay with me. There are more bonds yet to break.